Among the Threnn Dominion's officer academies, cadets learn a phrase before they learn how to plot a single navigation vector, a phrase drilled into them in their very first week of training. Repeated so often, it eventually stops sounding like a warning and starts sounding like scripture. Never assume the small ship is the weak one. The phrase has no attribution in any official Dominion record, because no officer wanted their name permanently attached to the incident that produced it. But every soldier in Threnn space knows exactly where it came from, and every soldier in Threnn space, if pressed, in the honest quiet of a mess hall after too much fermented ration wine, will admit that the phrase is not really about tactics at all. It is about a single human ship, barely a tenth the mass of a proper Dominion cruiser, crewed by fewer than 200 souls, that appeared out of the dark 11 years into the First Contact War, and over the course of 4 brutal months, did something no vessel in the recorded history of the Dominion's 8,000-year military tradition had ever managed to do. It made an empire that had never lost a war afraid. Its name in the clipped, unadorned language humans favored for their machines of war was the Kestrel. It was not built to be feared. It was, in the beginning, barely built to survive. To understand why a single ship could accomplish what entire human fleets could not, you first have to understand what the Threnn Dominion actually was, in the years before humanity ever crossed its path, because the Dominion that met humanity was not a young, hungry empire testing the edges of its own strength. It was old in the way certain mountain ranges are old, worn smooth not by any single cataclysm, but by the patient, grinding accumulation of 3,000 years of unbroken conquest. A civilization that had annexed, absorbed, or simply erased over 200 distinct pre-Starflight species in its long march outward from its homeworld, and that had, somewhere in the second millennium of that expansion, stopped thinking of war as a possibility to be prepared for and started thinking of it as a formality to be processed. Dominion war colleges did not teach doubt. They taught procedure, the standard sequence of contact, demand, and if demand was refused, the brief, efficient application of overwhelming force that had ended every single one of the Dominion's prior 200 annexations within, at most, a matter of months. Officers who rose through Dominion ranks were selected not for creativity or adaptability, but for their fluency in that procedure, their ability to execute it flawlessly. And by the time the Dominion's expansion finally reached the sparse, unremarkable stretch of space that human colonial charts labeled the Meridian Expanse, the entire apparatus of Dominion military thought had not meaningfully innovated in generations, because it had never once been forced to. The First Contact War did not begin the way humanity's later confrontations with the wider galaxy would begin, with ancient councils and formal exile, and the cold, bloodless language of diplomatic judgment. It began with a mistake, the kind of mistake that only a civilization utterly certain of its own supremacy could make. The Threnn Dominion, having spent 3,000 years expanding outward from its homeworld in a slow, methodical, and almost entirely unopposed campaign of annexation, encountered humanity's first extrasolar colony, a modest agricultural settlement on a temperate world humans had named New Meridian, and did what it had done to every pre-Starflight civilization it had ever encountered in 3,000 years of expansion. It classified the population as a resource rather than a people, moved to subjugate the colony with a single garrison cruiser, and expected, based on 3,000 years of unbroken precedent, that the matter would be settled within the week. It was not settled within the week. It was not settled within the year. New Meridian's colonists, only 2 generations removed from Earth and equipped with nothing more advanced than mining lasers, atmospheric shuttles, and a stubborn, generational memory of every war their ancestors had ever fought over far pettier reasons, did not surrender. They did not know, in that first chaotic month, that they were making history. They only knew that a garrison cruiser had descended into their sky demanding tribute, and that the alternative to fighting was a kind of servitude none of them, not even the ones who had never held a weapon in their lives, were prepared to accept. The Threnn garrison commander, an officer named Vrail Kassanen who had overseen 11 previous annexations without incident, lost 40% of his ground forces in the first 3 weeks to an insurgency fought with repurposed mining equipment, and a tactical creativity his own training had never prepared him to anticipate. And by the time Dominion High Command HFY accepted that New Meridian would require a proper military response rather than a policing action, humanity's fledgling interstellar government, barely a decade old, and still governing a scattered handful of colonies from a capital on Earth that most of the galaxy did not yet know existed, had already declared what history would later call the First Contact War. The images that reached Earth in those first chaotic weeks, grainy, delayed transmissions relayed across a dozen struggling colonial networks, showed something the wider galaxy had apparently forgotten was possible. Farmers standing shoulder to shoulder with off-duty shuttle pilots and retired miners, holding a defensive line around a grain silo with equipment never designed for combat, simply because retreat had never occurred to them as an option worth considering. Kassanen's own after-action report, later recovered and studied extensively by Dominion analysts trying to understand what had gone wrong, described the New Meridian insurgency not as an army, which would have at least fit an established category of resistance the Dominion knew how to counter, but as something closer to a weather system, diffuse, unpredictable, and seemingly capable of regenerating itself from losses that would have shattered the morale of any properly organized military force the Dominion had previously encountered. He requested reinforcement within the first month. By the time it arrived, 4 months later, New Meridian's colonists had not merely held the line. They had, in a raid that would become the stuff of Earth's earliest wartime folklore, captured 2 of Kassanen's own shuttles and used them to evacuate their most vulnerable civilians to a fortified outpost deep in the world's northern highlands, buying themselves the time that would eventually allow Earth's newly formed defense ministry to organize something resembling an actual relief effort. Nobody in the Dominion took the declaration seriously. Why would they? Humanity, at the outbreak of the war, possessed exactly 11 warships worthy of the name, cobbled together from civilian hulls never designed for combat, armed with weapon systems still in their first generation of development, crewed by sailors and pilots whose combined military experience amounted to less than a single Dominion officer's standard training cycle. The Dominion possessed a standing navy of over 11,000 vessels, refined across 3 millennia of continuous warfare against 100 different species, commanded by officers who had never known a year of their lives, without a war being fought somewhere on the Dominion's ever-expanding frontier. By every rational measure available to Dominion military intelligence, the war should have ended within 6 months, with New Meridian and every other human colony absorbed into the Dominion's tributary network exactly as every other pre-Starflight civilization before them had been absorbed. It did not end within 6 months, because of a woman named Captain Yuen Marisol Ibarra and the ship she commanded, and the 11 years of grinding, desperate, asymmetric warfare that followed before either side had caused to believe the outcome was anything but inevitable. Ibarra had not been a soldier before the war. She had been, in the years before the Dominion's garrison cruiser first descended into New Meridian sky, a salvage captain, running a small independent vessel through the debris fields left behind by humanity's earliest, most disastrous attempts at asteroid mining, a woman who had learned to keep a ship running on borrowed parts and stubborn improvisation, because the alternative, in the unforgiving economics of frontier salvage work, was simply not flying at all. She had grown up on a mining station orbiting a gas giant on the edge of human space, the daughter of a shift supervisor and a hydroponics technician, and had left school at 16 to crew salvage runs rather than pursue any of the more conventional careers her teachers had assumed a bright, methodical student like her would eventually choose. Her instructors, in later interviews conducted after her name had become known across two civilizations, remembered her less for any particular flash of brilliance than for a quality that would come to define her entire military career: an almost unsettling calm under conditions that reduced other people to panic, a habit of treating catastrophic equipment failure not as an emergency, but as simply the next problem in a long, familiar sequence of problems to be solved in order. When the war began, and Earth's newly formed defense ministry put out the desperate, galaxy-wide call for any spacer willing to convert a civilian hull into something resembling a warship, Ibarra was among the first to answer, not out of any particular patriotism, her old crew would later say, but out of the same flat, practical calculation that had guided every decision of her working life. Somebody was going to have to fight this war with what was actually available, rather than what anyone wished was available, and she happened to know more about keeping an underpowered, overstressed ship functional under impossible conditions than almost anyone else humanity had left. She did not wait to be assigned a vessel. She walked into the Defense Ministry's improvised recruitment office in the first week of the war with a proposal already drafted, a plan to convert her own retired salvage hauler, the Amaranth Drift, into a fighting ship using techniques she had spent a decade perfecting on equipment nobody had ever expected to survive as long as it had. And the harried, overwhelmed officer who reviewed her proposal, with no better options on his desk and a war already underway, approved it within the hour. The Kestrel began its existence as the Amaranth Drift, a mid-sized bulk hauler built for hauling ore between the asteroid fields of humanity's home system, a ship with no weapons, no shielding worth mentioning, and an engine architecture designed for slow, steady, fuel-efficient cargo runs rather than the violent maneuvering of combat. Converted in 11 frantic weeks by a skeleton crew of engineers working in a shipyard that had, until the war began, never built anything more dangerous than a mining drone, it emerged from that conversion looking, by any conventional military standard, faintly ridiculous. A boxy, ungainly hull studded with mismatched weapon turrets salvaged from a dozen different civilian and light military designs, armor plating welded on in whatever configuration the available scrap metal happened to allow, and a crew complement stitched together from salvage hands, asteroid miners, and a handful of the newly formed Defense Ministry's first, half-trained volunteers. Ibarra insisted, over the objections of at least 2 ministry officials, who considered the request an eccentric waste of an already impossibly tight construction schedule, on retaining the Amaranth Drift's original, over-engineered structural frame, rather than replacing it with a lighter, more conventional military chassis, a decision that struck her supervising engineers, in the moment, as needlessly stubborn. It would prove, within the first year of the ship's service, to be the single most important decision made in its entire construction, because a frame built to survive a lifetime of collisions with tumbling ore fragments turned out to be far better suited to the violent, close quarters maneuvering the ship would eventually become famous for than any lighter, more conventionally elegant warship hull the Dominion had ever fielded. When it launched, renamed the Kestrel at Ibarra's own insistence, because a kestrel, she told her crew, was a small bird that hunted things many times its own size and had never once seemed to notice the disparity. Nobody in Earth's fledgling command structure expected it to survive its first engagement. It survived its first 17. The tactic that made the Kestrel's reputation, the tactic that would eventually be studied, dissected, and taught in the very Dominion academies that had once dismissed humanity as a footnote in their annexation timeline, was born not out of brilliance but out of necessity, the same way nearly every innovation of the early war years had been born. Ibarra understood, from her first engagement against a Dominion patrol cruiser twice the Kestrel's mass and immeasurably better armed, that her ship could not win a battle fought on Dominion terms, a straightforward exchange of firepower at standard engagement range, where 3,000 years of refined weapons technology would simply overwhelm a converted ore hauler within minutes. So she refused to fight on those terms. She took the Kestrel in close, closer than any Dominion tactical doctrine considered survivable, exploiting the simple, overlooked fact that Dominion warships, built for millennia of engagements against enemies who fought at range, mounted point defense systems optimized for intercepting long-range projectiles and torpedoes, not for tracking a fast, erratic target maneuvering inside their own minimum engagement envelope. At close range, the Kestrel's mismatched, improvised weapons, useless against a properly shielded warship at standard distance, could exploit the narrow gaps in a Dominion cruiser's point defense coverage, striking exposed sensor arrays, engine housings, and weapon mounts with a precision that had nothing to do with superior technology, and everything to do with a crew that had spent years navigating far more dangerous obstacles than an alien warship. Threading salvage vessels through the collapsing debris fields of dying asteroids, where a single miscalculation meant instant death. The tactic worked because it violated an assumption so deeply embedded in Dominion military doctrine that no officer serving in the war's early years had ever thought to question it. The assumption that a small, weaker ship would behave like a smaller, weaker ship, would seek distance, would attempt to flee or negotiate or simply die according to the tidy mathematics of relative firepower. The Kestrel did not behave like a weaker ship. It behaved like a predator that had simply decided the normal rules of size did not apply to it, and Dominion captains, trained across 3,000 years to expect fear and retreat from anything smaller than themselves, found themselves, again and again, catastrophically unprepared for a ship that instead came closer and closer and closer, until it was already inside their guard before their tactical systems had finished calculating that it should not have dared to be there at all. By the end of its first year in service, the Kestrel had engaged and disabled or destroyed 9 Dominion vessels, an achievement that would have been remarkable for any single ship in any navy in the galaxy, and was already, at that point, deeply outmatched, statistically speaking, on paper, by every metric the Dominion's own war colleges would have used to model the engagement. It should not have been possible. Dominion war planners, reviewing the after-action reports of the Kestrel's early engagements, initially assumed pilot error, faulty sensor data, or simple statistical anomaly, the kind of unlikely but not impossible outlier that any sufficiently large dataset eventually produces. It took nearly 2 years, and the loss of 4 additional cruisers to the same ship, before Dominion intelligence was willing to accept the far more uncomfortable conclusion that the Kestrel's success was not an anomaly at all, but the visible, repeatable product of a way of fighting that Dominion doctrine had no answer for, because Dominion doctrine had never needed one. Captain Ibarra's crew in those early years were not soldiers in any traditional sense, and she never pretended otherwise. Her weapons officer, a broad, quiet man named Desmond Okafor, had spent the decade before the war running mineral surveys through some of the most hazardous debris fields humanity had ever mapped, and brought to the Kestrel's gunnery station an instinct for threading fire through narrow, moving gaps that no Dominion academy, however rigorous, had ever needed to teach its own officers. Because no Dominion officer had ever needed to shoot anything while dodging tumbling asteroid fragments the size of small moons. He had lost 2 fingers on his left hand to a survey accident years before the war, a fact he mentioned so rarely that most of the Kestrel's later recruits never even noticed, and he calibrated the ship's improvised weapon systems by feel as much as by instrument readout. A habit that struck newer crew members as almost superstitious, until they watched him put 3 consecutive shots through a target gap barely wider than the Kestrel's own hull at a closing speed that made the ship's tactical computer refuse, on more than one occasion, to even generate a firing solution. Her helmsman, a sharp, restless young woman named Priya Chandrasekhar, barely into her 20s when the war began, had grown up piloting salvage tugs through the same fields, and flew the Kestrel with a loose, improvisational aggression that Ibarra herself, twice Chandrasekhar's age and considerably more cautious by temperament, privately admitted she would never have dared attempt on her own. Chandrasekhar had been orphaned young, raised largely by an aunt who worked the same salvage circuit Ibarra had once worked, and she brought to the Kestrel's helm a fearlessness that her crewmates alternately admired and found genuinely terrifying, a willingness to take the ship through maneuvers that violated every safety margin any conventional pilot's training would have insisted upon. Because she had spent her entire adolescence learning that the margins printed in a training manual, and the margins that actually existed in a chaotic debris field, were very rarely the same thing. The ship's chief engineer, a stooped, endlessly irritable man named Fyodor Basargin, who had kept mining equipment functioning on a shoestring budget for 30 years before the war gave his particular genius somewhere more dramatic to be applied, treated the Kestrel's constantly failing, mismatched systems the way a farmer treats a stubborn, aging animal, with equal parts affection and profanity, and an absolute, unshakable refusal to let it die on his watch. Basargin had personally rebuilt the ship's primary power, coupling 11 separate times over the course of the war, each time from a slightly different configuration of salvaged parts, and had developed in the process an understanding of the Kestrel's unique, idiosyncratic engineering that existed nowhere in any schematic or manual, an understanding so deeply personal that when a young replacement engineer once suggested, late in the war, that the ship might benefit from a full system standardization to make future repairs easy, for anyone other than Basargin himself, the old engineer reportedly responded that standardizing the Kestrel would be like performing surgery on a living thing to make it easier to embalm. Around this small, unlikely core, the Kestrel's crew grew and changed across the 11 years of war that followed, losing people to injury, exhaustion, and death, gaining new volunteers drawn from every corner of humanity's scattered colonies, farmers and teachers, and retired shuttle pilots who had heard the growing legend of the small ship that refused to lose and wanted, whatever their previous lives had prepared them for, to be part of whatever came next. Ibarra never turned away a volunteer for lack of formal military experience, because she had built the ship's entire reputation on the understanding that formal military experience, the kind the Dominion possessed in inexhaustible supply, was not actually the thing that had kept her ship alive. What had kept it alive was a crew that had spent their whole lives solving problems nobody else had thought to prepare for, and that quality, she often told her officers, could not be taught in any academy, Dominion or human, because it could only be forged the hard way, through years of having no other choice. Word of the Kestrel spread through Dominion space long before it spread through humanity's own scattered colonies, because the Dominion, for all its rigid hierarchy, maintained a far more centralized and efficient system of military communication than humanity's fledgling, decentralized defense ministry had yet managed to build, and every lost cruiser, every disabled patrol vessel, generated a formal after-action report that eventually crossed the desk of someone senior enough to start asking uncomfortable questions. By the war's third year, Dominion Naval Intelligence had assigned the ship a formal threat designation, a bureaucratic classification code that meant nothing to anyone outside a briefing room, but the crews serving on the Dominion's frontier, the ones who actually had to fly patrols through the sectors where the small, ugly human ship was known to operate, had already given it a different name entirely, whispered in mess halls and repeated in nervous briefings before every patrol. The Ghost Hawk, for the way it seemed to appear from nowhere, strike with lethal, surgical precision, and vanish back into the dark before a proper counterattack could ever be organized. The Dominion's response, when it finally came in the war's fourth year, was the kind of response only a civilization with limitless resources and a wounded, ancient pride could afford. They stopped sending single cruisers to hunt the Kestrel and started sending task forces. 3 ships, then 5, then, by the middle of the 4th year, entire strike groups of 8 and 10 vessels, dispatched specifically to locate and destroy the one human ship that had, through nothing more than persistence and audacity, become a greater irritant to Dominion naval pride than the whole of the rest of humanity's scattered, struggling fleet combined. Ibarra, watching the size of the forces arrayed against her single ship grow with each passing month, understood exactly what was happening, and understood, with the same flat, practical clarity that had defined every decision of her career, that the response meant something far more important than any individual battle. It meant the Dominion, for the first time in 3,000 years of unbroken military dominance, was afraid. The engagement that would come to define the entire war, the one still taught, dissected, and occasionally romanticized in academies on both sides of the conflict, a generation later, took place in the 4th year of the war, in the debris-choked expanse of what human charts called the Cygnus Rift and Dominion charts called, with considerably less poetry, sector designation 11 Delta. The Dominion had assembled, specifically for the purpose of ending the Kestrel's 4-year campaign of humiliation once and for all. A strike force of 12 vessels under the command of a decorated and deeply frustrated officer named Fleet Marshal Orrin Vashett, a veteran of over 200 successful engagements across a 40-year career who had, in the 6 months since taking personal command of the Kestrel hunt, developed something approaching genuine obsession with the single, small human ship that had made his otherwise flawless service record look, for the first time in his life, incomplete. Vashett was not a fool, whatever his frustration might have suggested to junior officers watching him pore over the Kestrel's after-action reports late into every ship's night cycle. He had studied every engagement, every recorded tactic, every account from surviving Dominion crews who had faced the ship and lived, and he had, by the time his strike force finally cornered the Kestrel in the Cygnus Rift, built what he believed was a genuinely comprehensive counterterm. Azure, 12 ships arranged not in the standard Dominion attack formation the Kestrel had exploited so ruthlessly in its earlier engagements, but in a deliberately loose, overlapping web of coverage, specifically designed to eliminate the close-range blind spots the human ship had always relied upon. Each vessel's point defense envelope calibrated to cover the gaps in its neighbor's fields of fire. On paper, in the sterile, confident language of Dominion tactical simulation, the formation should have made close-range engagement suicidal for any single attacking vessel, however maneuverable, however cleverly piloted. Vashett had, in effect, built a cage with no visible bars, confident that the one predator small enough to have slipped through every net cast before it would finally find no gap left to exploit. He had not accounted for the debris field. The Cygnus Rift was not simply a convenient location for an ambush. It was the shattered remnant of a planet destroyed millennia earlier by forces no scholar on either side of the war fully understood. A vast, slow-moving field of rock and ice fragments ranging from dust to masses the size of small moons, drifting through a stretch of space, nearly 2 light towers across in a chaotic, only partially predictable pattern that had claimed more unwary ships over the centuries than any deliberate weapon. Dominion tactical doctrine treated debris fields as hazards to be navigated around wherever possible, obstacles that degraded sensor accuracy and complicated formation keeping, the kind of environment 3,000 years of orderly, open-space naval tradition had simply never developed much appetite for fighting within. Ibarra, whose entire pre-war career had been spent navigating precisely this kind of chaotic, unpredictable terrain in ships far less capable than the Kestrel, understood the rift not as a hazard, but as home ground, and when Vashett's 12-ship formation finally cornered her against what his tactical officers assured him was an impassable wall of drifting rock, she did not attempt to flee the trap. She flew directly into the heart of it. What followed, across the 11 hours that Dominion records would later classify, with a certain grim understatement, as the Cygnus Rift engagement, was not a battle in any sense that Vashit's 40 years of experience had prepared him to recognize. The Kestrel vanished almost immediately into the dense heart of the debris field, its hulls mismatched, improvised armor plating scraping and grinding against tumbling ice fragments in maneuvers that would have shattered the hull of any properly designed Dominion warship within minutes. But that the Kestrel, built from the salvaged, over-engineered bones of a civilian mining vessel, was, by pure accident of its original purpose, uniquely equipped to survive. Chandrasekhar flew the ship through gaps in the tumbling debris that Dominion sensor operators insisted, in increasingly panicked reports to Vashit's flagship, could not possibly be navigable at the speeds the human ship was maintaining, using the debris itself as cover, as a weapon, as a constantly shifting maze that made the Dominion formations overlapping fields of fire, so carefully calculated in the sterile confidence of a strategy session. Functionally useless against a target that never remained in open space long enough for any single ship to acquire a clean firing solution. One by one, across those 11 brutal hours, Vashit's carefully arranged cage began to come apart. A Dominion escort cruiser, maneuvering too aggressively to keep pace with a target its sensors could barely track, collided with a debris fragment its own navigational array had failed to register in time, crippling its engines and forcing it to withdraw. Another vessel, its point defense systems firing continuously at phantom contacts generated by the debris field's chaotic electromagnetic interference, exhausted its ready ammunition stores chasing shadows and was left, for a critical 20-minute window, with no functional defense at all. A window the Kestrel exploited with a single, devastating close-range pass that tore through the ship's exposed engine housing and left it drifting, disabled, among the very rocks it had been sent to hunt through. By the 6th hour, 3 of Vashit's 12 ships were disabled or destroyed, and the fleet marshal, watching his meticulously planned formation dissolve into confused, uncoordinated chaos across his tactical display, made the decision that would define the rest of his career, and in the estimation of Dominion historians writing decades later, the entire remaining course of the war. He ordered a full withdrawal, conceding the field to a single ship, a tenth the mass of his own flagship, because he had finally fully understood something his 40 years of unbroken victory had never once forced him to confront. The Kestrel was not simply lucky. It was not simply well-piloted. It represented an entirely different philosophy of warfare, one built not on the patient, overwhelming application of superior resources, but on the desperate, endlessly adaptive ingenuity of a species that had never once, in its brief and violent history, been permitted the luxury of assuming its enemies would fight fair. Fleet Marshal Vashit's official report on the Cygnus Rift engagement, later declassified and studied extensively by military historians on both sides of the eventual peace, contained a line that would go on to be quoted, translated, and repeated across 100 different worlds in the decades that followed. We did not lose this engagement because the enemy possessed superior technology, superior numbers, or superior firepower. We lost because we assumed a war could only be fought the way we have always fought it, and the enemy, having no 3,000 years of tradition to unlearn, simply fought the war that was actually in front of them. It was this report, more than any single battle, that finally forced the Dominion's high command to confront the possibility that the war they had entered expecting to conclude within 6 months might, in fact, be unwinnable by any means short of a total, civilization-ending commitment of resources that even the vast, patient Dominion might struggle to sustain indefinitely. The Kestrel did not survive the war unscathed, and Ibarra never allowed her crew, or the growing legend building around them, to forget the cost. In the 7th year of the war, in an engagement near a human colony called Providence Reach that Dominion forces had targeted for a punitive bombardment intended, in part, to draw the Kestrel into a fight it could not decline. The ship took catastrophic damage protecting a civilian evacuation convoy, losing 11 of its crew, including Desmond Okafor, the weapons officer whose instinctive, self-taught gunnery had made so many of the ship's earlier engagements possible. Ibarra herself was badly injured in that engagement and spent the better part of 4 months recovering in a makeshift medical bay, while a skeleton crew, led by an increasingly capable Chandrasekhar, kept the ship running well enough to remain a credible threat. Because both the crew and Earth's Defense Ministry understood by that point in the war that the Kestrel's continued existence, its continued reputation, had become a strategic asset worth more than almost any single fleet action humanity could otherwise mount. A galaxy that believed a single battered human ship could still appear anywhere at any time and inflict disproportionate damage on any force sent against it, was a galaxy that hesitated, however briefly, before committing its full weight to any single engagement. And in a war humanity could not hope to win through raw material strength, hesitation, bought however dearly, was worth more than steel. By the war's 9th year, the Kestrel's legend had grown far beyond the ship's actual, modest capabilities, in the way legends always eventually outgrow the facts that first produced them. Dominion propaganda officers, struggling to explain a decade of humiliation to a domestic population that had been raised on 3,000 years of unbroken victory, began quietly discouraging open discussion of the ship's exploits, not because the stories were false, but because the true stories had already become difficult enough to explain without the exaggerated versions circulating among frontier crews making the situation worse. Human propaganda, by contrast, embraced the legend without hesitation, because a species fighting an existential war against an empire 1,100 times, its military strength needed every scrap of morale it could manufacture, and the story of a converted ore hauler, crewed by salvage workers and asteroid miners, humbling the war fleets of an empire 3,000 years in the making, was exactly the kind of story a young, frightened, embattled civilization needed to tell itself in order to keep believing survival was possible. The war ended in the 11th year, not with a final, decisive battle, but with the slow, grinding exhaustion of a Dominion political structure that had never, in 3,000 years of expansion, faced a conflict it could not resolve through simple, patient application of overwhelming force, and that found itself, after more than a decade of mounting losses and diminishing returns, no longer able to justify the cost of a war against a species that had proven, again and again, that its small size and limited resources were no longer reliable predictors of the damage it could inflict. The peace that followed was neither total victory nor total defeat, a carefully negotiated settlement that recognized humanity's sovereignty over its existing colonies, while establishing a demilitarized boundary between human and Dominion space, a settlement humanity's negotiators, exhausted after 11 years of war fought with a fraction of the Dom. Inion's resources, accepted with a mixture of relief and quiet, unspoken pride that no formal document could fully capture. Captain Ibarra was present at the formal signing, standing in her dress uniform beside the diplomats who had done the actual work of negotiating the peace, because Earth's government understood, even in that moment of careful diplomatic ceremony, that the woman and the ship she commanded had done more to secure that peace than any negotiator's argument ever could have on its own. The Kestrel itself, battered, patched, and rebuilt so many times across 11 years of continuous war that almost nothing of the original Amaranth drift remained beneath its scarred, improvised hull, was retired from active service the following year, not because it was no longer capable of fighting, but because Earth's Defense Ministry understood that some ships earned the right to become something more than a weapon. It was moved, with full military honors, to a permanent orbital berth above Earth itself, where it remains to this day, visible from the surface on clear nights as a small, dark silhouette against the stars, a monument not to the war it fought, but to the simple, stubborn principle its crew had proven across 11 brutal years. That size, tradition, and precedent were never the true measures of what a ship, or a species, could become, when it had nothing left to rely on but its own refusal to accept the ending it had been assigned. Dominion cadets, generations later, still learn the phrase in their first week of training, still repeat it without always understanding, in the sterile comfort of a modern classroom, exactly how much blood and fear had gone into writing it. Never assume the small ship is the weak one. They rarely learn, in that same first week, the ship's name, or the names of the salvage workers and miners who crewed it, or the debris field where an empire's 3,000-year certainty first began, quietly and irreversibly, to crack. But somewhere in the archives of a war college on a world most humans will never visit, buried in a declassified report written by a defeated fleet marshal, who spent the rest of his long life trying to understand what he had truly lost that day in the Cygnus Rift, the truth remains, patient and unerased, for anyone curious enough to go looking for it. That the galaxy's oldest and proudest empire was first taught to fear humanity not by a fleet, not by a weapon, not by any grand or overwhelming show of force, but by a single, ugly, overworked little ship that simply refused, against every reasonable expectation, to stop coming back.